Thank you, Caleb, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening for the second session of our series on Who Still Cares About Climate Change, Congregational Responses to Denial and Despair. And last week we looked at how soft forms of denial help us to keep from feeling some of the troubling emotions that we feel around climate change. This evening, for our second session, we're going to look more directly at the science of climate change and some of the impacts, especially in Ohio, which is where this event is based, even though a number of us are from other places. So Ohio's climate impacts and responses with Aaron Wilson and Jason Cervenek, professors there. I will be introducing them later. I think I will go ahead and turn it over now to the worship.
Barb and I guess Tim, if you're sharing in that opening call and response song again. For those of us who were here last week, please sing along with Tim, although everyone other than Barb and Tim will stay on mute.
We are going to sing, it's a song called Be With Us Now. It's by Brett Hesla. And so what I'm going to do is I will sing and ask you to echo me. And again, Tim is going to echo me. And so to kind of, so that you can hear how that echo goes and you can just follow along with him. God of earth,
God of earth,
and every creature,
and every creature,
God of wind,
God of wind,
and God of the sky,
and God of the sky,
God of old,
God of old,
and new creation,
and new creation.
be with us now.
Be with us now.
Be with us now.
Be with us now.
God who moves,
God who moves
across the water.
across the water.
God who moves,
God who moves
across all time.
across all time.
God who moves,
God who moves
within my walking.
within my
Be
walking.
with us now.
Be with us now.
Be with us now.
Be with us now.
Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as come out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth."
Old Turtle by Douglas Wood. Watercolors by Chang Ki-chi.
Once, long, long ago, yet somehow not so very long,
when all the animals
And rocks
and winds and waters and trees.
And birds and fish.
And all the beings of the world could speak and understand one another.
There began an argument.
It began softly at first.
Quiet as the first breeze that whispered, "He is a wind who is never still."
Quiet as the stone that answered, "He is a great rock that never moves."
Gentle as the mountain that rumbled, God is a snowy peak high above the clouds.
And the fish in the ocean that answered, God is a swimmer in the dark blue depths of the sea.
"No," said the star, "God is a twinkling and a shining far, far away."
"No," replied the ant, "God is a sound and a smell and a feeling who is very, very close."
God, insisted the antelope, is a runner, swift and free, who loves to leap and race with the wind.
She is a great tree, murmured the willow, a part of the world always growing and always giving.
"You are wrong," argued the island. "God is separate and apart."
"God is like the shining sun, far above all things," added the blue sky.
No, he is a river who flows through the very heart of things, thundered the waterfall.
She is a hunter, roared the lion.
"God is gentle," chirped the robin.
"He is powerful," growled the bear.
And the argument grew louder and louder and louder until
Stop!
A new voice spoke. It rumbled loudly like thunder, and it whispered softly like butterfly sneezes.
The voice seemed to come from, it seemed to come from Old Turtle.
Old Turtle hardly ever said anything, and certainly never argued about God. But now Old Turtle began to speak.
God is indeed deep, she said to the fish in the sea, and much higher than high, she told the mountains.
"He is swift and free as the wind, and still and solid as a great rock," she said to the breezes and stones.
"She is the life of the world," Turtle said to the willow, "always close by, yet beyond the farthest twinkling light," she told the ant and the star.
God is gentle and powerful, above all things and within all things.
God is all that we dream of and all that we seek, said Old Turtle. All that we come from and all that we can find. God is.
Old Turtle had never said so much before. All the beings of the world were surprised and became very quiet. But Old Turtle had one more thing to say.
"There will soon be a new family of beings in the world," she said, "and they will be strange and wonderful. They will be reminders of all that God is."
They will come in many colors and shapes, with different faces and different ways of speaking. Their thoughts will soar to the stars, but their feet will walk the earth.
They will possess many powers. They will be strong yet tender, a message of love from God to the earth, and a prayer from the earth back to God. And the people came.
But the people forgot. They forgot that they were a message of love and a prayer from the earth.
And they began to argue about who knew God and who did not, and where God was and was not, and whether God was or was not.
And often the people misused their powers and hurt one another or killed one another.
And they hurt the earth until finally even the forests began to die.
And the rivers and the oceans and the plants and the animals and the earth itself, because the people could not remember who they were or where God was.
Until one day there came a voice like the growling of thunder, but as soft as butterfly sneezes. Please stop.
The voice seemed to come from the mountain who rumbled, "Sometimes I see God swimming in the dark blue depths of the sea."
And from the ocean who sighed, he is often among the snow-capped peaks reflecting the sun.
From the stone who said, "I sometimes feel her breath as she blows by."
And from the breeze who whispered, I feel his still presence as I dance among the rocks.
And the star declared, "God is very close."
And the island added, his love touches everything.
And after a long, lonesome, and scary time,
The people listened and began to hear and to see God in one another.
And in the beauty of all the earth.
An old turtle smiled.
and so did God. Let's join in singing.
God of the sparrow, God of the whale, God of the swirling stars, why does a creature say "oh"? How does a creature say praise? God of the earthquake, God of the storm, God of the trumpet blast, how does the creature cry woe? How does the creature cry save? God of the rainbow, God of the cross, God of the empty grave, how does the creature say grace? How does the creature say thanks? God of the hungry, God of the sick, God of the prodigal, how does the creature say care? How does the creature say life? God of the neighbor, God of the foe, God of the brooding wood, how does the creature say love? How does the creature say peace? God of the ages, God near at hand, God of the loving heart, how do your children say joy? How do your children say oh?
A word of thanks again to Barb and to Dan Royer Miller, whose voices you heard there. Would you pray with me? God, you made a covenant with all creatures of all flesh on this entire earth. Help us to live within the bounds of that covenant, to respect the other partners of our covenant community, the community you created that extends far beyond our human brothers and sisters, to include all of the creatures of this earth that you intended to bless. Be with us today to soak in what we can of the news of the communities in this region of Ohio where many of us gather. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, worship team, for the scripture and story. Welcome to this second night on climate change, and we're very pleased to have with us Aaron Wilson and Jason Cervenek, both from the Byrd Polar and Climate Research Center at The Ohio State University. Aaron is an atmospheric scientist, both a research scientist, but also part of the extension program. He's a member of the State Climate Office of Ohio. And as a nearly lifelong Ohioan, he was inspired from a young age by the power of weather and has followed his passion with a deep commitment to the Ohio region. Everyone at the rural to urban gradient to think about your climate change and how changing weather extremes are impacting you where you live. Jason Cervenek is Education and Outreach Director at Byrd. He currently has 4 National Science Foundation research projects, led the development of the Columbus Climate Adaptation Plan. He's a former high school science teacher, participated in a Fulbright teacher exchange program in Mumbai, India, where he witnessed firsthand the challenges faced by much of the world's population. He volunteers with Franklin County Juvenile Court's Restorative Justice Circles. He enjoys hiking and cycling. He has worked with Creation Care teams, or does work with Creation Care teams, both at his parish, Christ the King Catholic Church, and also with the Diocese of Columbus. And he lives with his wife and 2 children in a home on the Near East Side of Columbus. Jason and Aaron will be sharing with us for the next hour. And then once again, we will give 15 minutes for you to give some reflection on how what they are talking about can help you to think about your context and what you might be doing in your communities and in your congregations. And then also, once again, we last time decided to have some informal talk afterwards for about, we can go up to half an hour from 8:30 to 9 for any of those who would like to. It's fine if you need to leave before that. So I think, Aaron, you're up next, and we look forward to what you have for us.
Thank you so much, Doug. So hopefully this is coming through a little bit better.
It is.
Awesome. So yeah, I decided to dismantle it a little bit. So I still do not have the ability to share screen yet. Well, while Caleb's doing
that, you
that's
should
okay.
be able to now.
All right. There we go. Let's see. Always little hiccups, or it wouldn't be a Zoom call. That's sort of all of our lives these days. So that's okay. We just roll with it. So yes, it is an honor and a privilege to be coming to you tonight to talk about, now if I can get this to work. All right, let's try it again. For whatever reason, it's not wanting to come up. So just bear with me just a second here. Let's try it one more time. And it's not letting me. There we go.
Your computer's getting ready for Halloween, Aaron.
I guess so. It's tired today. It's been a long day, so it's probably done for the day. But no, we're here to talk about Ohio's climate impacts and responses. And I really appreciate that introduction. And I find myself in an interesting position, both as being in the middle, halftime really with research. The other half is really about engaging communities, particularly the agricultural community throughout Ohio, to think about climate change here at home, here in Ohio. A lot of our colleagues at Bird Polar study very provocative things like melting ice, glacier retreat, ice sheets that are melting. But I would argue that the changes that are taking place right here close to home are just as impactful for those that live here, and drawing those connections between the global changes and the local changes is really important. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to think about what's happening right here. And that's the bulk of my story, is going to be the science of climate change, both globally and here at home, and then turn it over to Jason to talk more about the messaging, communication, impacts, and things like that as well. So a little bit more about my background. I grew up in Miamisburg, Ohio, so not too far probably from most of you on the call here, there in Southwest Ohio. I can go to many places in Ohio, and most folks don't actually know where Miamisburg is, which is pretty interesting if you go up to Northeast Ohio and such. But when I was 3 years old, my family and I, we moved to Miami, Florida. And even at 3 years old, you become quickly aware of the power of weather. With tropical cyclones and hurricanes. And we never took a direct hit while I was there, although my grandmother much later took a direct hit from Hurricane Andrew. Whenever we had a storm get close, we'd go down to the beach, and I'd watch the interaction of the storm and the ocean. And just that's when the idea of the power of weather really kind of set in. And I was amazed at an early age, and I have felt really blessed to know that I wanted to do something with weather my entire life. A few years later, we moved back to Ohio. And of course, in 1988 was the big dry. According to Time magazine, that was a major drought across much of the Midwest, as well as Ohio. And I like to kid around with my ag folks that was my retirement from farming. That drought was enough to drive me out of farming there. So that's a picture of me the last time I was on a tractor there in the top center of the screen. But no, I was always interested in agricultural science, but more so on the weather. Some of you may remember John Hope here in the bottom center. He was the hurricane specialist with the Weather Channel. And I watched hours and hours and hours. This is just him and talking about Hurricane Hugo as it approached Charleston, South Carolina. My family lived there. But just watching how he communicates his passion of weather was something that was really kind of inspiration for me. I did go to Ohio State, and I've done all my degrees there at Ohio State, bachelor's. I went back. This is a picture of Scott Hall where Jason and I work. Not so much these days with COVID, but that is home of the Bird Polar and Climate Research Center. And like was mentioned, I work with the State Climate Office. I work a lot with the ag folks from around the state as well. So as we get started here, I mean, what Doug mentioned in terms of those questions to think about is exactly how I tend to start all my talks is, let's just take a deep breath and think about, what ways, have weather patterns changed here in Ohio? What have we experienced, or have they changed, in other locations that you've lived? What are the impacts that you feel, or you think, you have felt personally? What about your community? And then eventually we can get to the responses. But it's a perfect way to really set the tone for this, because that's really what we're trying to envision here. And of course, I've got to unshare this one more time, and I really apologize, but I didn't optimize this for a video clip, and I want to make sure that it plays okay for everybody. All right, so we should be okay now. So when we think about, weather and climate, this is where I like to start thinking about the high frequency changes in temperature, wind speed caused by an imbalance of energy across the globe. That's what weather is. We deal with large ranges, high degree of variability. So this is really what we live day in and day out. Every waking moment. Weather is continuous; it's constantly changing. We can get up in the morning and temperatures can rise 20, 30 degrees in a matter of 2 or 3 hours, and they fall just as quickly, especially this time of the year in the evening after the sun goes down. But all those rapid changes in our weather, it's very difficult to discern patterns when we're living them day in, day out, right? We after a while we can start to notice if things are stuck. We're seeing the same weather every day. But overall, what we try to do is zoom out as meteorologists and we look for patterns. So this is just a series of satellite images stitched across the surface of the Earth. You can see after just a couple of minutes, less than a minute here of looking at it, patterns pop out. These fast moving swirls of storms across the Southern Ocean. We have storms that move west to east across the northern hemisphere as well, but they're a little bit different than they are here in the Southern Ocean. Maybe the pulses of bright white clouds on the equator here going in the opposite direction. After a while, we start to see that there are patterns that are developing within this cloud illustration, and that's exactly what we mean by weather patterns. It's the patterns that we expect, and over a long period of time, those weather patterns establish that climate, the averages over longer periods, means, standard deviations, things like that. So if I were to ask you, what is this video down or this picture down here in the bottom right? We're zoomed in on this, so it's kind of difficult to tell. And a lot of kids like to say it looks like a zebra, and those, all the guesses are great. But I'm going to play another video, and as you'll see here in a second, we're looking at a dog, and we're out walking our dog. So Aaron, what does this have to do with weather and climate? So that dog, as we know, dogs are driven by some natural tendency, chaotic nature. We know how chaotic they can be. Fire hydrants, McDonald's wrappers, other dogs can take them in the opposite direction. Now, at any one time, that dog could be moving in a different direction than we're moving. Okay. Even though we know they'll both be about in this place here in the future. And that's based on what we see, the path that the dog walker's taken here with the blue footprints. So even though that dog's meandering back and forth as you're walking along the sidewalk, you're both expected to still walk in that general same direction into the future, right? Based on all the evidence we see. So we can think of the dog as our weather, and we're the dog walker, we're the climate. So as the climate moves, that dog is still meandering back and forth, giving us our record highs, giving us our record lows, giving us our cold temperatures like polar vortex events and warm winters, or really cool days in a warm October. This is the type of thing that we talk about, and we try to make those connections between weather and climate. And I think this is a good illustration of that. Now, Ohio's not immune to extreme weather, and this is something I think is really important when we talk about what we're seeing. When we think about extreme weather, some folks immediately go to the flood of 1913. This is Miamisburg. This was before the levees were built. The destruction that weather often brings is oftentimes a rallying point, right, of community coming together, of helping one another recover from these disasters. We can think about blizzards. This is probably the last bona fide blizzard in much of Ohio in 1978. We've had heavier snowstorms for sure. 16, 18 inches down in Southwest Ohio not too long ago, about 10, 12 years now. The derecho of 2012, long-lived line of thunderstorms, a lot of destruction that impacted the Miami Valley. And then, of course, last year's tornado outbreak across the region. These are extreme events. So one of the things that we like to do is look at how these extreme events are changing. And if we look at the 2019 $1 billion weather and climate disasters, we had 14 of them. And you can see they're a little bit different nature depending on where you are in the United States. Wildfires out west. We worry about hurricanes along our coasts and flooding inland. And that's important. Okay, that's another concept here that I like to start us with. But if you look at the last 40 years here of data since 1980, this is the mean, and it's in accumulation for the year. So this is the yearly total here on the right. The mean is around $6 billion weather events per year. This is all of our recent years, 2017 and 2011, we had 16, which is currently where we are for 2020 as well, tied for the most billion-dollar weather disasters, uh, all adjusted for the consumer price index. And so our changing extremes is important. And so what I like to do is I like to think about Ohio in terms of what is the face of climate in Ohio. We are a water-rich region. Even in the middle of a drought, we're not that far from a flooding event or flash flooding event. We've spent a lot of money, a lot of loss on rain-related disasters, and so changes that we're seeing are likely to be highly reflected in the changes to our precipitation patterns. And I think that you'll see that as I go along today. So I just wanted to give you an example of how we live this. We're coming off this growing season. I'm going to kind of keep it in terms that I talk to farmers a lot about. If we're looking at April 15th through the 17th, on the left-hand side, this is what our average temperature departure from the long-term mean is, which we use 1981 to 2010. You see a lot of gray areas across the Midwest. Temperature-wise, it was an average season. Now, hopefully you're saying, wait, I remember a really cold April, and man, July was really hot this year. And you're absolutely correct. But this is what it looks like from an average sense in the statistics for a climatologist. When we look at the rainfall, this is this is what it looks like. Drier across the Miami Valley, certainly because of our summer. Not so much because of the spring when it was fairly wet, but we've got areas of above and below average across Ohio. So a range of conditions, another year of seasonal extremes. So I'm going to zoom in because this is kind of that climate picture. This is that dog walker picture. But let's look at what the dog did during that time. And the dog is illustrated by these gray bars. That's a high temperature and low temperature every single day of the year so far. The red is the warmest we've ever been for that date, and the blue is the coldest, and this is for Dayton International Airport, right? So we can see that dog meandering back and forth throughout time. We had very warm temperatures during our winter time. Several days that were near record highs. We had very cold temperatures, late season freezes in April and May, did a lot of damage to some specialty crops across the state. This is what we live, are these extremes, these ups and downs, the chaotic nature. And so hopefully this just illustrates a little bit more how those how those two relate to one another between what we experience in weather and how we define it in climate. So when we look at our springtime, for instance, really it was an average temperature spring. How does that work? Well, we had our 11th warmest March and our 34th coldest April going back, those records go back to 1895. So warm March, cold April, divide by 2, you get average. That's how averages work, right? But we feel and we experience these temperatures that were 7, 8, 9 degrees below average in April and May. Or our June temperatures or July temperatures. We had our 6th warmest July on record. So all of those, coldest April and May, warmest Julys, those sorts of statistics average out to a pretty average season. So that's how those two work. And if we look at precip, the same thing. The snapshot on the left where you see a lot of green, 17th wettest spring. On the right, this was our 29th driest summer. So again, it's kind of differentiating between those two extremes that we live. So hopefully that's a kind of an illustration of what we live just this past season and how it relates to weather and climate. Now, if we zoom out and we look at a global assessment, all right, so what we can do is we have confidence in our instrumentation back to the late 1800s. And we could take a 20th century average, the mean over 100 years between 1901 and 2000. We can compare every year to that mean, and we can see it was colder than the 20th century mean in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We can see the strong warming since the 1970s. And in fact, 2019 ranks as the second warmest since 1880. 2020 is currently on pace to overtake 2019 as the second warmest. But when you start stacking these up and you think that 9 out of the top 10 warmest years have all occurred since 2005, and the 5 warmest years all have happened in the last 5 years, it's pretty astounding. And the one I like to use is that if you were born after February of 1985, you've never experienced a cooler than average month for the planet. That's the Reagan administration. That's how far back you have to go. One of the other important points is that if you look at the changes over time on the globe, at any one time, you've got regional differences. Some areas cooler than average, some areas warmer than average, until we get into the 70s, 80s, and beyond, when we start to overtake and get much more area covered by those really warm temperatures, especially into the Arctic and parts of the Antarctic, where we know warming is happening at a much faster rate. And of course, that has implications for our global climate as well. Quickly kind of going through this a little bit to think about what's at play here, because we hear this argument and the denial about cycles, natural cycles, and we have these natural cycles of Earth's orbit going around the sun, circular, oval. We know we're wobbling. We know that we're changing the obliquity, the tilt of the Earth, and all of these things change the amount of energy that's coming in and striking the Earth's surface. And all of our natural cycles, in essence, are trending us toward cooler temperatures, cooler conditions, right? That's where our natural cycles take us. One of the other ways that we change climate is through changing the composition of our atmosphere. And the funny thing is that when we think about things like carbon dioxide, this is not a new story. The effects of carbon dioxide on our atmosphere have been known for a very long time. All the way back to the 1700s, thinking about the greenhouse effect. Eunice Foote actually doing experiments to look at the warming effects of sunlight on different types of gases. More greenhouse gas work by John Tyndall, Svante Arrhenius, all the way up to 1958 when Charles Keeling started measuring carbon dioxide in Hawaii. So I'm going to play this video here. And I'll sort of talk over this a little bit. So in addition to the natural cycles, we think about the gases and how they've changed our atmosphere. So, and we know that as we add more carbon dioxide, more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we get warmer conditions. But this is really how it was discovered in 1958 in terms of how things are changing here on Earth. So young Charles Keeling here in 1958 started measuring CO2. He had some engineering skills and put together instruments for this. So as in typical in science, sometimes you don't know what you're looking at. It takes a while. So, you notice that things seemed kind of erratic, but over time, as he continued to monitor, eventually, again, we start to see a pattern, the seasonal rhythm. So carbon dioxide peaks in the spring and then sinks in the fall and then starts building again once trees start dropping their leaves in the northern hemisphere, I would say. So we know what's happening because we have a lot of places that are measuring, a network of stations that are tracking these patterns now. And we know that CO2 it doesn't sit in one place where it's emitted. It gets circulated. So that's really what this simulation is showing, this video is showing here. So the good thing about data is that the more data you have, the more confidence you gain in what you're seeing. The more answers you're able to answer, questions you're able to answer, but also more questions that you start to have. And certainly May of 1958, starting out at 318, it has been rising very quickly since then. And it's known as the Keeling curve. So this was in 2014, 402 parts per million. Okay, and really, the question is how much do we have at the end of this, mid 21st century or even late 21st century? This is where we have the power to make decisions that will help shape, right, where we end up on that curve. So it's very important to think about that. It's just not, a foregone conclusion. It really depends on the types of decisions that we make. Okay, so I think that's really important. So how this works is pretty simple. If you take an atmosphere that has nothing in it, it's got sunlight, shortwave radiation, visible light, it comes down, hits the surface of the earth. Everything on the surface of the earth mostly absorbs this energy, transforms it to infrared light or long wave radiation. If there's nothing there to trap that long wave radiation, it escapes to space. We have greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, water vapor being the largest, and CO2, and then some trace elements, smaller amounts of methane and nitrous oxide. They don't care about the visible light, right? They're not impacted by the visible light, but once that infrared comes off the Earth's surface, they gobble it up, they get greedy, and the more atmospheric particles that we have in the atmosphere, more of these greenhouse gases, the more energy gets absorbed by those particles. It gets radiated to other particles around them back to the Earth's surface, and the surface stays warmer than it otherwise would. Now, water vapor and carbon dioxide keep us 60 degrees warmer than we're 60 degrees warmer than we would be without them. But as we add more of those particles, more of that energy is absorbed there in the atmosphere. So 318 parts per million in 1958. We're at 418 parts per million now. Based on our ice core records, where we drill into ice and we extract the air bubbles and we can see what the CO2 concentration is, during ice here on Earth, here on Ohio, we're looking at 180 parts per million CO2, 280 parts per million during the warmest periods of the Earth. So thousands of years to go 100 parts per million, which is what we've done in 60 years through the burning of fossil fuels. And this is why we're concerned, just the rapid pace of those emissions. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of implications for this. I want to get to the local aspects here. What's driving the local aspects? We know ice melts, it's provocative, it contributes to sea level rise. Folks along the coast are dealing with that on a daily basis, inundated by water during high tides, even if it's sunny out without storms. We know our sea ice is decreasing. We know our glaciers are retreating. But what are the impacts here? If not directly from those, what about in Ohio? We can argue our temperatures are increasing, but the water vapor, the amount of water vapor that's in the atmosphere is going up as well. And that contributes to what we're seeing. So it's very important to think about the personal face of climate change. If you're in California, you're dealing with the wildfires up and down the West Coast. That is the personal face of in the climate challenge in those regions. If you're in the Gulf Coast or the Southeast, you're dealing with those hurricanes and the strongest of those hurricanes increasing intensity and duration. More rainfall, 35, 40, 65 inches of rainfall out of Harvey in Beaumont, Texas. These are huge storms having an impact there. And here in the Midwest, it's an increase in our extreme precipitation values, the heaviest precipitation. So we would argue that climate change is a threat multiplier. It makes what we do harder, makes it more difficult, right? There are a lot of issues, socioeconomic and others, that we have, but they all are compounded by climate change. And Jason will get into that a lot more. So I'm going to swiftly go through this because I've been kind of dragging time here a little bit and getting started. But, we know that our temperatures are warming, but our temperatures are warming more quickly in the wintertime than in the summertime, and more quickly at night than during the day. In fact, we see fewer 100-degree days during the summer now than we did in the early part of the 20th century, but we see a lot more 70s and even 80s in our cities that contribute to urban heat islands, for instance. We know that the winters and springs are warming much faster than the summers and the fall. And that has implications on a lot of things, from agriculture to pests to plants, unpredictable growing seasons, disconnections between our pollinators and our plants, for instance. and birds and the like, really having impacts in a lot of areas of our lives. The precipitation has gone up across the US about 4%, but not everywhere. You'll notice the desert Southwest has been getting drier. Parts of the Southeast have been getting drier. But here across the Midwest, the South Central and Northeast, we're looking at about 4% increase. It's 5 to 15% here in Ohio, driven strongly by traditional off-season rainfall and an increase in the intensity of those rainfall events. So for instance, we're getting a lot more fall precipitation, some 35%, for instance, up in north central Ohio, a 35% increase since 1950. But across the board, generally, we're seeing wetter springs, wetter falls, somewhat drier parts of our winter and summer as well. Yeah, getting a surprise visit from the little one. So if you look at the top 10 warmest and the top 10 wettest, the top 10, sorry, the 4 out of the top 10 warmest and 6 of the top 10 wettest have all occurred since 2003. And 7 of the top 10 warmest and 8 of the top 10 wettest since 1990. So indeed, things are warmer, they're wetter, and that has implications right here in Ohio. We expect in the future, using imperfect tools that, what we call models, right? All models are wrong, some are useful, that our temperatures will be 4 to 5 degrees warmer with 3 to 5 inches of rain per year more than we're seeing now in the 21st, middle part of the 21st century. So we're really challenged on a lot of fronts in terms of the types of changes that we're expecting to see. What we're seeing is a seasonal redistribution of precip. Again, fall, winter, spring increases that are likely to continue, with summer water shortages due to more intense droughts, right? So you can get wetter scenarios with more drought. It is indeed a very challenge, very obstacle-laden path as we see it moving forward. So when we think about things that we're seeing, we're essentially moving and migrating our climate from one of, what we think of as Ohio to more like a Carolina winter and more like an Arkansas summer. And I think that helps visualize, okay, so how's my life impacted if I was living in an Arkansas climate for the summer or a Carolina winter climate? There could be pros, there could be cons, but it's important to think about what those things are, and we'll get into more of that as we move forward. So there are numerous challenges. We're not without challenges, and I want to make sure that we understand too that we've got some opportunities. I think for me, agriculture and the agricultural community really has an immense opportunity to be part of the solutions. We think about all of these different issues, from increased weed pressure, insect pressure, invasive non-native plants and animal ranges, but overall greater flood risk, intense flood risk, transportation issues, reduced water quality. All of these things are impacting all of our communities right here in Ohio. So I think every one of us can be part of the solutions, thinking about, how do we mitigate, how do we adapt to these changes, which becomes more costly as we move in the future, but also what can we do to mitigate these changes? Because we know that our fingerprint is on, and we can see that in the science that I've already illustrated. So what are we dealing with as we move forward, and how can we be part of those solutions? From conservation to changes in agriculture, to urban resilience, to cooling centers, all these different things that we have to do to adapt and to mitigate as well. So kind of my key takeaways here are 3 things that I want you to remember. Is that science is clear. The science is clear here that climate change is real and human activity is the main driver of the climate change we see today. But importantly, that climate change is personal. It affects individuals, communities, states, and nations differently, but it does affect us all. And understanding those connections of what we see right here in Ohio is very important. And I think our responses can be tailored to our personal lives as well. From farmers to bankers to teachers to all walks of life, understanding what the impacts are in our day-to-day lives and how then we can be better stewards of the resources that we're giving here. So I'll go ahead and stop, and I will turn the presentation over to Jason. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. I think it's been a while since we've done a presentation together. Yeah, so Aaron and I get to work together quite a bit. So I'm going to discuss some impacts, information I think is relevant to understanding action and ways to try to keep this hopeful, which is kind of the tone of how you said tonight. I think there's a lot of research right now that this needs to be an uplifting message, and there's nothing worse than leaving people on kind of a down note that they can't take action. That being said, there's a lot of imperative things to do over the next few years. So I enjoy being outdoors, which is probably why I work where I do. In a former life, I was a high school science teacher for 11 years. It was mentioned I did teach in Mumbai, India, and got quite a bit of time to travel around the country there. I did see people, there's 1 million people living in that city at sea level in a 1 by 1 square mile area with a massive economy that are living in poverty and that are really at risk if sea level goes up. I also got a chance to go inland and saw ancient step wells the water table was dropped well below that step well, and they were drilling large boreholes with putting fossil fuel powered pumps on to pump water out of to grow sugarcane. And I realized what I saw was the water table dropping hundreds of feet, now in an area where they have to bring tanker loads of water in during dry seasons when they have a monsoon failure, because there's no way to provide sufficient water for those communities. They're just depleting that water table over time. And then my wife and I live in downtown Columbus. We have 3 children. We have a 1.5-month-old right now. Just born a month and a half old, so has not shown up in this picture yet. We love cycling around, and a lot of what I know now and a lot of what Aaron knows kind of changes the way we think about making decisions and spending money and voting and all those important things that have an impact on individual actions and collective actions. So I do like to show this graph. I know Aaron kind of led in with it, the Keeling curve, probably the most famous graph in earth sciences, but it's always informative to kind of put big events in your life on this curve. In 1960, when Keeling starts measuring it, we're just under 320 parts per million. When I was born, we had about 340. I graduated from high school at 360. I started at the Bird Center, and Aaron and I used to talk about just being below 400. And now we're, 410, actually 415, 418 regularly. So this has been a pretty dramatic change that I can measure just over the course of my life, how dramatically that percentage has increased. So I'll break this talk down to 3 big parts. The first is impacts and things that we see, and Aaron's discussed those. I think temperature in Ohio is one way to look at it, especially the change in our seasons, these warming nights, warming winters, and then precip, the variability, more heavy rainfall events, but punctuated by dry spells. It's interesting if, depending on what part of what job you have or what you work in, to look at an area that typically doesn't talk about environmental issues in a soft way, and that's the business community. And there's a risk assessment that's put out by the World Economic Forum every year. This was the 2019 Global Risk Assessment. This is the big step back look at what are our risks. So things that are really likely show up on the right-hand side, things that are really impactful show up on the top. So if you look in this right-hand quadrant, you look at, well, what's up there? What should people really be worried about in the insurance and business industry? And if I zoom in there, here's the things that show up in 2019. Extreme weather events, failure of climate change mitigation adaptation, natural disasters, cyber attacks, man-made environmental disasters, biodiversity loss, large-scale involuntary migration, water crises, interstate conflict. If you look at what shows up on here, most of these, 6 to 7 of them, are all in some way connected to climate change. What's interesting is what you don't see here is pandemics. You'd have to back up to the previous graph and see pandemics, and spread of infectious disease actually shows up here on the left-hand side. So extremely impactful, but at the time not considered very likely. And if you look at the research communities Aaron and I sit in, there's been overwhelming evidence of the impact of climate change for 60 years. And so we have a very clear understanding of what the likelihood of things happening are and the impact. And yet that message really hasn't matched up until more recently with maybe an imperative to do something about it. You can also look at this from the realm of political cartoons. My father used to work at a composing room in a newspaper. So I always enjoyed looking at that section of the newspaper. This is one depiction of, what COVID looks like and kind of the recession behind that. But then climate change is this tsunami. And a lot of researchers are looking at COVID, and our response to COVID is kind of a practice run of of what it's going to look like when we have to make massive decisions in a really short time scale with climate change, especially since we've not made a lot of important decisions leading up to it that may have made that transition much easier. So what are our options? And as we start to get to what can we do, it's important to know, well, what's the roadmap and how could this play itself out? Mitigation, so this is stopping greenhouse gas emissions, or in some cases actually pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, not just nature and trees and dissolving it in the ocean, but actually industrial scale processes to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. And that's one thing that's very, very important, but the ship has sailed on that fully dealing with the problem because we now see the effects of climate change, and we have for 50, 60 years. And it's becoming more pronounced over the last 20. So we need to change how we operate. And a lot of our work with the city of Columbus was thinking, how do we build infrastructure and plan and change our behaviors, acknowledging we're not going to be able to mitigate our way out of this any longer. We're going to have to change some things and change how we operate. But there is the third option, which is the place you don't want to find yourself, which is suffering. So if you fail to adapt and you fail to mitigate, you inevitably find yourself in this position, which is the place where no local government or state government wants to find itself. In fact, we found out as we started to work with a lot of planners and decision makers and adaptation, they started to become much more engaged in discussing mitigation because they realized it had costs. People assume, well, if I do nothing, it's free. Well, it might be free now, but those costs catch up to you over time. And suffering is the place you find yourself if you don't do the other two. Now, I should say this is not an equitable process. Those that are least contributing to the problem are going to be the ones that face the most consequences of this. They don't have the financial resources to elevate their house, buy air conditioning, afford to run air conditioning. But they also tend to be the people that aren't flying around a lot, have a lot of square footage to heat or cool, and maybe are expending as much fossil fuels on buying items that are frivolous. So we need to think about there's a justice issue here, which is a domain you don't see the sciences. And I'll talk at the end, things that science really can't measure, but there's a justice aspect to this, that these are those that are most hurt, least contributed to the problem. So that's kind of the background, maybe the most demoralizing part of the talk. Now we'll look at kind of information and how people get information, which is an ongoing discussion, I think, in the US right now. I think we've seen this over the last few years. I think when I moved out of the classroom and started working at Bird, I had seen the beginning of this, but how do we look at our current media landscape and ask, where are people getting information and how is that biased in some ways? I always like to look back and think about the radio broadcast by Orson Welles in the 30s. There were people that actually committed suicide as a result of this. There was a disclaimer read before this radio broadcast, but there are many people that actually thought this was a real alien invasion. And since it was broadcast on the radio, that was perceived at the time as a source of validated information, doing that event was seen as there was a lot of questions about how it was done after the fact, even though it was just a piece of entertainment. We also know there's publications out, The Onion. We've seen leaders around the world actually repost stuff from this, not realizing this is designed to be a satirical piece of information, just designed to put pieces out of fun. But if you don't know how to think about the media landscape or really sort fact and fiction, it's easy to fall into that rabbit hole now, because many of these don't have editorial boards like books where you had to get a publisher to publish your work and go through a filtering process. And a lot of the high school students we work with and middle school students, I try to tell them that the world I grew up in, where the encyclopedia and that book had to go through a publisher to get on the shelf of the library and go through a librarian, that doesn't exist anymore. So if you give me $45 in 2.5 hours, I can build you a really good website, and I can tell you anything I want, and I can make myself seem to be anybody I want. But is that really something, am I somebody you want to take your definitive health information from? Or am I just selling you stuff with ads in the bottom and really trying to keep you captive on my site, clicking things because that's making me revenue? And understanding that is important as when I was young, understanding how my father's newspaper really operated. And while they were selling the news and subscriptions, the real money there was had by advertising. And advertising made newspapers work. And if you understand newspapers a little bit, you understand how their entire model's blown up recently because of that. So Vanessa Otero, who's in Florida at a university, created this graphic in 2016. It's got many iterations since that are even more nuanced with this, trying to help people understand, like, where is the current media landscape? Complex news at the top. At the bottom is stuff that's more clickbait. There's ad revenue coming in, but it's really not a good source of information. and then the political spectrum shown across the bottom axis. Political left on the left-hand side, political right on the right-hand side, and really thinking about where are people getting information from. And when I have friends that post stuff on social media, usually the first thing I look at is not the headline or the author or anything. I look and see where it was from. And if it's in that bottom section of this depiction, like I'm definitely not sharing it. I might look at it for fun, but that's pretty much where it's going to end, because I don't want to be part of this problem of spreading misinformation. And you can see at the top some of the real definitive newspaper sources in the country, News, NPR, Wall Street Journal. But there is even nuance in this. For example, the Wall Street Journal, excellent coverage for business reporting. If you're looking at insurance, actuarial stuff, I would never get my science information from the Wall Street Journal. Its science is awful, especially its earth science and its atmospheric sciences. So it helps to know this landscape and think critically about where stuff is coming from that you're looking at and reading. This goes back quite some time. I speak to this because climate change is something that exists in the here and the now, but this is a legacy of last century that my family actually lives with. So my daughter at 1 year of age was found to have a high level of lead. We have an old house in Columbus we renovated. We were extremely careful, we thought. Obviously, we weren't careful enough. And when she went in for that test, there's actually a law in Ohio that 1-year-olds have to have a test done. And my wife gave me this frantic call saying, like, Catherine's got an elevated level of lead, like what happened? And so we spent some time figuring this out. And it so happens that lead has been known since Roman times to be toxic. And it was actually outlawed in most European countries in the early part of the 1900s. But that wasn't the case in the US. We didn't actually outlaw it until the 70s. And largely the reason for that, and it's been heavily researched and unpacked, is the industries that were selling us leaded gas and leaded paint lobbied heavily to make sure their products could still be sold. And I actually undercut the science and made it so that the science was uncertain, and made sure the scientists couldn't share the information, and that information never ended up informing government operations. Now, we could say, well, is this a one-time fluke event? We don't have to go very far to see another example. Smoking is a great example of this, right? So the first Surgeon General report that articulated the impact of smoking just on lung cancer in general, cardiopulmonary issue, was in 1967. It wasn't until the big settlement in 98 after we had a whistleblower come forward. And so we had, examples, and I could give other ones. You could have the hole in the ozone layer. But there's so many of these things that are climate change analogs where we've seen the science undercut by a communications message. I would argue the same, Aaron and I had a conversation the other day about this, the same method is being used with the pandemic currently, where we have one or two maybe fringe scientists that are saying herd immunity is the way to go, even though this is not what 99% of epidemiologists are saying. And we have some leadership that's saying, well, let's go for that. And we have this very similar communications wrapping put around science that allows a message that isn't really scientific to drive the decision making. And it's important, I think, each of us that are sitting at home making decisions with our dollars every day and voting, understand how there's a lot of money to be lost by decisions getting made, and those may be driving decisions that are having long-term health effects. Smoking, lead in paint, that have repercussions hundreds of years later, not just in the immediate decade. You can look at another example of how this played out. Actually, decision makers in government attacking science. This played out over the Stalin regime in Russia. There was a leader in the biological community, Lysenko. He did not believe in genetics, and was very well connected, and actually got the entire Russian government to refute genetics, and basically sent all the researchers that accepted genetics who were doing research to concentration camps in Siberia, and undercut their entire biological research community, even though they're far ahead, and ended up decimating their agricultural industry and their ability to produce agricultural products. This was written up in Nature not too many years ago, but another example of how this plays out when you have a lot of political intrusion in just the science operating and being allowed to share what it knows to allow decision makers to make decisions. So for this segment, to close it out, if you do want to know more about this, Merchants of Doubt is an excellent book. Naomi Oreskes is a history researcher at Harvard. She's actually speaking at OSU in just a few weeks. So I can send information about this. She's a phenomenal speaker. She's written an entire book on this, and she'll articulate how this same method of undermining science has been used again and again and again by certain special interests that want to undermine the science for their own gain and it's ending up harming the general public or causing us to, they privatize the income and then they push the risk off to the public to pay the consequences later. Another example of, if you want to know more of success stories of how we deal with disinformation, Finland is an excellent country that for their youth, as being a high school science teacher, I watch this pretty closely, has a public disinformation curriculum that they use with their youth. The reason is they are so close to Russia that there's been disinformation campaigns used against them in the past, all the way going back to the Second World War. And so this is actually an integral part to their curriculum. And their youth are heavily inoculated against disinformation, are very savvy in how they deal with it. So with that, I'll kind of shift gears to the third section, which is, how do we think about having difficult conversations with friends and family, members of our congregation, individuals that maybe are interested in the message or are willing to think critically about how this impacts others and are at least worth having that conversation with. So I'll mention some work that Yale and George Mason have done. They've done surveying for well over 10 years now. And when they do this surveying, it tries to capture where is the American populace. And actually, they do even Canada now. And most of us can fall into 6 bins right now. Alarmed being on one end of the continuum and dismissive being on the other end of the continuum. And there's certain characteristics we see in these. Now, you might say, well, how many Americans fall into each of these 6 bins, right? This is where it is today. And this is very different than where it was 15 years ago. More than 50% of Americans are actually in the alarmed and concerned category. And the right-hand category is the dismissive and doubtful. It's shrinking. It's shrinking pretty rapidly. So what this means for a lot of people is it might be worth having a conversation with somebody about climate change and the impacts that you aren't sure it would be in the past. You might have said, well, that person is probably not going to be receptive, or there's really not a conversation to be had here. With the right approach and the right topics, there might actually be space to have that conversation. And we're probably not discussing you entertaining a conversation over Thanksgiving dinner with your dismissive uncle. That's probably not a great way to go, because maybe it's a harder lift and that's maybe not the right venue. But that disengaged or cautious person in the family that maybe has the right frame of mind or is receptive to really deep conversation might be somebody you want to strike it up with. And that may be impressionable enough to help build a better understanding and a better response to dealing with climate change. So it's good to know that most people are actually on board with this conversation. And I can give you some more information to support that in just a second. The next part is scientists overwhelmingly, it says 97 to 98% of all scientists that work in Aaron's domain and all the publications support this. So if you ever are told, well, the science, it's not certain on climate change, it is. And it's been certain for a long time now. It's interesting though, if you ask most people in the US, is global warming happening? We're at about 67% as of last year. We still got 16% of people that deny it's happening at all, but that's changed dramatically over the last few years. You look at caused by human activities, then it drops off less. Just over half think it's caused by human activities. There's still a lot of people think it's nature and humans. And then if you look at this next number below that, most scientists think global warming is happening. If you ask the average American, do scientists agree on this? You find out only just over half of Americans think that scientists agree on this. Now, I show you these bottom 2 graphs for a reason. Remember that disinformation campaign I said that was bought by a lot of money spent by communications? That dropped these 2 numbers. That drove this. They realized that the best strategy to make the science not actionable wasn't to attack the response to it, was to make the scientists, the people that most people don't know that are working in basements like Aaron and I, seem devious or scandalous or just not really sure of what's happening. And they would bring out one person that was maybe on the fringe and they'd put them on the news. And they did that enough. And eventually these numbers dropped to most Americans saying, well, I really don't know. I see 2 people on the news and one saying it's happening and one says it's not. I don't know what to do. And in fact, there was a late night comedy show that ended up, their way of balancing that out was to bring 98 climate scientists out and 2 that weren't, and to put them on stage side by side to show the balance. If you look in Ohio last year, Ohio numbers aren't quite as strong. Only 50% think it's actually caused by human activities, and less than half think the science is clear. Better than where it was in 2016 in some ways, but not in others. Actually, Ohioans, you have less people think it's happening, but you also have fewer that think it's you have fewer that think it's happening today, but you also have fewer in the denial camp. So in Ohio, we've kind of gotten better in some ways, but not across the board in others. Now, once again, this is a little demoralizing, right? So can it get better from here? They also have done surveys on a host of questions that are even more nuanced, right? Remember those dismissive people that are on the right that really don't want to talk about this? They're not on board. You find out if you survey them, they really want to become more energy efficient. They tend to be very thrifty individuals. So if you say, I can make your home energy efficient, and you'll actually spend half the money to heat your house, and you'll save yourself a lot of money, they'll actually sign up and take those actions more than the people on the left-hand side of the continuum. So a great conversation with them is, how can we save money? And if it saves the environment, great. They might not really be interested in that as much, but they really will be happy to save money and will take those steps with you. So the right conversation starter can get you to the same place. So right now, the percentages at the top are for the US. I've also showed all the counties in Ohio, so you can get a sense of where is your county. And this does extend out to Indiana. Sorry if you're in Australia or Canada, I don't have any data from that, although George Mason does survey Canada now, so you can get information from that. But you'll see across the board, there's belief 71% in the US that this will harm future generations. You can see in the urban areas in the state, it's a little more prevalent. We can look at, is it already harming people in the US? Generally, no. You can see a little bit up in the northern part of the state, but there is widespread belief in Ohio, not as much in the country, that it's already harming people within the next 10 years. And then, do you ever speak about global warming? The graph gets chilly. Nobody talks about this, right? This is not the dinner conversation over Thanksgiving dinner. Once again, though, we probably need to figure out how to do this, and do this in places that have really wide spectrum of approaches. Most of our neighborhoods and places of business have become very segregated. How do we have this conversation in a place with a really wide audience that can be respectful and civil? We can look at other things. Renewable energy support in the US, 87%. Look at it all the way across the state. You see overwhelming support for this, right? So maybe this is a great conversation starter. You should regulate CO2 as a pollutant. 75% of people in the US, once again, you're in the high 60s, low 70s on this across the board. And then if you look at requiring 20% to come from renewables, once again, you're still well in the 60s. So those could be conversation starters. What about purchasing rebates for vehicles and renewable energy? Overwhelming support from that across the state. A little bit more in urban areas, but still, especially in the north and the middle part of the state, even in rural areas, you have overwhelming support for that. Many of those farms have wind turbines on them and have solar installs. Should teach about climate change. Overwhelming support for that. Maybe a little less so than some of the others, but still there. Not necessarily a high priority. So if you think that just changing Congress and the president are going to change hearts and minds on this, we may not get as many responses as we think. It might not be as rapid coming. I say that because a lot of our individual actions and what we do in our congregations and our local communities matter. They're not enough, but we have to jumpstart things somehow. And that is the place where a lot of the innovations happening in the US right now. Columbus has an issue on the ballot in 2 weeks that will commit the city with AEP to build a massive solar install that will provide 100% of the energy for the city by renewables with no additional cost, and people can opt out. And that is on the ballot in 2 weeks. Cincinnati and Cleveland have done similar things. You also have cities like Minster, Ohio, a small rural community that did that, I think, 5 or 6 years ago now. And other places like Lima that have done community-based energy efficiency programs to put it on people's property tax bills so it shows up differently than a loan on their balance sheet. Now, if you say, well, what's this look like? You show me rural, urban, you show me counties in Ohio. What about Democrats, Republicans? Once again, a lot of these same issues with renewables still have widespread support amongst both parties, more on the Democratic side. Republicans also overwhelmingly support a lot of these initiatives. And if you go to the George Mason site, you could pull all this up and see individually. Even teaching about climate change in schools, you're in the low to mid 60s on that as far as Republicans and Democrats. So there's a lot of possibilities here. It's just starting out with the right conversation. Some things to realize about your audience as I kind of close out here and we move into the Q&A. Realize there's certain things you can do to hamstring your message, a few hazards to give you. We tend to trust people more in our in-group. So realize you're going to have a lot more clout in your own faith community than if you go to speak to another group. I think for a lot of people in the Diocese of Columbus, myself and a colleague of mine, if we go in, we're Catholic, so there's a different conversation there, right? We're not an outsider coming in. So realize that is something that you have to think about carefully, because you can be a much stronger emissary for some communities, and for others, you'll be a weaker emissary. everybody assumes the information they know is obvious, right? So, if you get on board with this, don't assume that the person you strike up a conversation with is at the same place you are after you've thought about it from this retreat. Backfire effect, the more educated a person is, they're already locked in. If they're already locked into a view on climate change, the more you try to convince them, the stronger they will entrench themselves. And I have some colleagues, very well educated. They don't accept climate change. And it took us a few years to have a conversation. And the more you have that conversation, the more they would say they would build a case against it. So you have to realize having a really confrontational fight will actually make it worse, and it'll backfire even farther. We tend to do the building related to that, and I have some relatives that fall into this camp. Some people tend to do the opposite of what you're trying to convince them to do. Once again, that nudge might be better than browbeating. And then, related to that, what our current beliefs are, we will do almost anything to rationalize them. So we have to think about, and I always tell people this myself, like how I reflect on things. What are the things that I was so entrenched with that I had a hard time being convinced otherwise? And that helps me appreciate how much evidence is enough to help sway me on my own thoughts. It's actually made me a more reflective person, because there's things that I was very entrenched with that people came to me with evidence, and I at some point had to sit down and say, well, no, you've made a pretty strong case here, and if you're not willing to change your mind on something, it's not a really scientific way of looking at it. And so we always have to be open to having that conversation with someone.
Jason, I hate to interrupt. Could you
Yeah.
go back to before you have those highlights on top? I have a comment
Yeah.
in the chat from someone who'd like to screenshot this
Yes.
graph.
And there is if you screenshot it, the one at the bottom, it's yourbias.is. The entire thing can be printed out as a poster. You can order it. They have another one on like heuristics that we tend to use. But it's something that I've fundamentally believe now as a former science teacher, we need to teach this in school, just so people know, because so much of the marketing and advertising uses these strategies. And they know our brains better than we do. And the only way this is a fair fight is if we know the tactics that are being used. Okay, so lead with our best foot. If you're going to have this message with peers, frame the message correctly. That you don't start a first date by telling somebody your faults. That's probably not the way you want to start your climate change conversation, by telling them all the things that are really going to hurt your message. For Ohioans, I think this is the story of heat. This could be from agriculture, or what this means is a justice issue for people living in cities that can't afford air conditioning in the summer. It could be an issue of flooding, what this means for farm fields and material running off into sewers and drains, or inundating houses in low-income apartments that aren't elevated above the floodplain. It could be drinking water issues. My parents are from Toledo. We've seen a big shift in the northern part of the state. They had no water in Toledo for a few days because of the algal bloom. This is related to that water issue and the heat issue. So this might be a thing to talk about, fresh drinking water. Other communities, national security and humanitarian relief is the conversation. We've seen refugees coming from Central America. We've seen a mass fleeing of people from Syria. A lot of the civil unrest, especially in Syria, was driven by a millennial drought. Climate change drove those refugees, which has caused so much unrest in Europe. Syria is a relatively low populated country. It doesn't have a huge population, yet it's caused a lot of animosity and strife in Europe. So this is the beginning of migration due to climate change. And for others, it's public health, right? People, the one scientific person they work with every day or regularly come in contact with is a doctor. Number one reason youth come into hospitals in Central Ohio is respiratory distress. That will be made worse by climate change. So those are the places, the topics to talk about. Things that are hopeful. So these are all pictures of things my family does that have made our life better and have been kind of fun. Like we put a rain garden next to our yard with pollinators. And so we trenched the side of the yard. And that was a project we did to help stop stormwater from just washing into the street. But it improved our quality of life and was relatively low cost. We have an old house we repurposed that we made really energy efficient. The previous people lost this house in a federal foreclosure, and their gas bills the last month they owned a house were $600 a month. I found that out when I got the report the following year. $600 for 1 month of gas. Our highest bill since then is about $180, and most are less than 110 in the middle of winter. So there's an issue of they probably couldn't afford to heat the house, and they were wasting so much money on that, they couldn't afford their mortgage. And we know one of the big drivers for people not being able to afford either a house or a rental property is they don't think about the utilities when they get that loan or make that purchase. We put solar panels on, we got a loan to do that. And then we cycle around a lot, and the kids love doing that. And in fact, COVID, the worst thing is we have nowhere to go on our bikes more. We actually bike less than we used to because we used to go everywhere on bikes. Dialogue and empathy. So the more you can do dialogue and have conversations over meals and breaking bread, I think that's vitally important, especially a wide group of individuals, not just those of one mindset. Empathy is a double-edged sword. It's a great thing in most cases, but realize empathy also means we tend to identify with our group, but we tend to marginalize those in the outside. And there's an interesting book on this by Fritz Beithart. And he's German. I will not pronounce that correctly. He did a really short interview on NPR, which is interesting. His book, I'm finishing right now, but discusses a number of examples of where empathy can go wrong if we take it to the extreme. And a lot of times we identify with our in-group so much in our community, we marginalize those around us. And so much empathy for our own community means we don't empathize enough with others. And this is not allowing us to take actions to help the wider community. So it's something to reflect on. What are the narratives? Whose messages are you sharing? There's a lot of people in the US right now that are being hurt by climate change. You don't have to look to other countries for these messages. And many of them are in your own faith community. Those are the messages that are probably going to resonate the most. And those are the messages you want to elevate. For a lot of people, the science isn't going to be what it speaks loudly to them. It's going to be a faith community that lost their building or their congregation. Many of them lost their homes in a fire or were inundated by multiple hurricanes. That probably is going to be a message that's going to be a deeper conversation. And lastly, and this is something that I can give you numbers on, but the last thing I'm going to close on is a little deeper than that. These are appliances you have around your house. If you wanted to power any of these appliances, you'd have to put people on exercise bikes with a dynamo on it. So if you want to power a 100-watt traditional light bulb, you need to hop on a bike. And if you pedal, you can keep that light bulb lit. If you want to toast bread, you better have 11 of you on your bikes. And if you want to run that microwave oven, you better line up 15 of your family members on those bikes, and you can run the microwave as long as you keep cycling. Now, I mention this because currently in the US, each of us has the equivalent of 100 servants every day, pedaling these bikes and running dynamos to power our houses and our cars and industry. Now, there aren't obviously people doing this anymore. There's fossil fuels. You're burning fossil fuels to provide electricity or oil to heat your house or natural gas or for a car, gasoline. But that's how many people you would have needed to do this in the past. And I say this because who reaps the benefits and who pays the cost of this? Me running electricity here, short of what's coming off my solar panels, and I do buy renewable energy for the grid. If I'm a typical Columbus household, I'm deriving a lot of benefit from this. Some of the cost is paid by somebody on the Ohio River that's breathing in the pollution from the coal coming off, the soot coming off that coal burning operation. It gets a little bit deeper than that, though. And I say that because science is very good at telling us what is and what's happening in the world and what's likely to happen. It doesn't do a good job answering questions of justice. And we had a speaker a few weeks ago, Richard Alley, who's an alum of OSU, and he's written a really interesting book called Earth, the Operator's Manual. And he actually shows this previous graphic in his book of how many humans we need to do our stuff every day, the equivalents. And he actually kind of ends it on a pretty profound note, I think, that as I've reflected on more, has been a greater meaning to me, but also left me jarred at first, which is in the past, the issues of the Civil War and talking about slavery in the US really ended up becoming an issue of justice wrapped up in an issue of economics. We can't change the economy, even if it's critical for how we treat people and what's just, because it'll decimate the economy. And Richard proposes that we're in a similar moment right now. We all need the equivalent of 100 servants to do our energy every day. This is derived from fossil fuel, but there are people being hurt by this. And is it an unjust situation? And yet some people are benefiting from it. And we haven't gotten to the justice conversation because we're stuck on an economic discussion. The economic discussion of, can we do this? Can we move the needle? Or is this just too harmful for certain people that derive benefit from the current economy? And so we haven't really pushed ourselves into the conversation of what's right yet. I would leave you with that because the scientific community can't answer questions of justice. We can't discuss what's good or bad about a situation. We're not set up for that. That's where faith communities and people thinking deeply about this from a moral and ethical standpoint kind of enter the domain. And that's the second part to the story that has to be brought to the table, because the science will not push us into a decision-making process of what we should or shouldn't do. It will just give us the tools to help make the decision. And so with that, I'll close out. and take questions if anybody has them.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm wondering about here, we wanted to give people a little bit of time to reflect on what they've heard. And I wonder, given the time, whether we can do that first. And Jason, can you stick around for another 12 minutes or so for questions? Or
Yep.
okay, I think Aaron, you maybe have to go.
I still have a few minutes. Yeah.
Oh, well, maybe while Aaron is, if there are any questions for Aaron, maybe we should do that. And I think, Caleb, you're kind of watching to see if anybody puts their hand up. Irv?
One of the, thank you both, really excellent and helpful. One of the things that struck me, Aaron, and I think it was during your time, you talked about how disasters are a point of bringing people together. And we, in our faith tradition, have what we call Brethren Disaster Relief Ministries. I think the Mennonites do similar work. And we do rally around disasters. It just sparked a thought in my mind of wondering if we could somehow infuse in our disaster ministries, which pull support from across our theological spectrum, into somehow having the disaster prevention being part of that ministry. So it just sparked an idea. I don't know where to go with that exactly, but found that intriguing.
Well, we still have both speakers. I'll jump in here. There's a comment in the chat hoping that both Aaron and Jason would be willing to share their slides. If you're willing to share that at some point, probably send them to Doug, and then we'll get it sent out with the email blast for the next week, if you're willing.
Yep.
I'm waiting. Mine is a little off topic.
Go ahead, Sue. Speak up.
Oh, this is a little off the topic, but I'm wondering, with the rate that we're cutting down forests and doing all the things we're doing, I understand there's more carbon dioxide, but is there less oxygen? I mean, if we don't die from all this other stuff, are we going to have not enough oxygen to breathe?
Yeah, Aaron, I'll let you weigh in on that first.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's more than sufficient. I think the difference is how CO2 behaves with interacting with visible light and infrared light to trap the heat. But there's still be more than sufficient oxygen. I think that's not as much of a concern. That you are right that if CO2 levels go up, oxygen levels go down. I mean, the two are closely coupled. But there's really been no concern there. There has been a concern for the nutritional value of plants, because with additional CO2, the nutritional value goes down because the minerals and nutrients are diluted. And so there's discussion of like what the nutrient means for wildlife and humans and that. But as far as the oxygen side of things goes, there's really not been any concern that there won't be sufficient. Mm-hmm. There would be less.
I see Patricia Kraybacher unmuted. She also has a comment here in the chat. Have Jason or Aaron seen the 2020 movie Kiss the Ground, talking about the release of legacy carbon into the atmosphere? Patricia, do you want to say anything else about that? Or
I do. I have not been a historical supporter of climate change per se. I'm a big picture person, and I'm just getting into agriculture in my retirement. My husband and I run a community garden, but we are learning some amazing things about how hard it is to farm. You know, our soil is dead. And this movie, I saw it 2 nights ago, And that's the reason I decided to register for this retreat. I think it's so amazing. And I don't know if either one of them have seen it. It's on YouTube. It's also on Netflix. It's free.
I have not, but I know Aaron probably can speak for hours on all the opportunities in the agricultural industry, like the agricultural sector, for having a favorable impact on climate change and water quality, and even in our urban areas, issues of food deserts.
Right. And
Yeah, so I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it yet, but this is the second time in I think 3 weeks that I've heard it brought up. And I sort of glanced over the one slide I had about really the path to agriculture as a solution is through healthy soil and water. And soil is so critical here. Even from a mitigation standpoint, Dr. Ratan Lal at OSU just received the World Food Prize this past week. 20% or 10% of our current emissions can be drawn down through healthy soils if we instituted things, on a larger scale across the world. So that's certainly, I think, a very good point. And I think that that's where the connection with farmers and agriculture, the community is really gaining a foothold, is in the stewardship of those soil resources.
But each one of us is a farmer. Each one of us
Yes.
has a choice to plant something, to plant trees, to plant our own food, to
Yep.
take care of our soil. If we changed our food subsidies in the US,
Yep.
instead of basing them on yield and instead base them on the quality of your soil, is it alive? Does it
Mhm.
does it have the biology in it to grow healthy plants and
Yeah,
make
and there are
healthy
some
food?
countries.
Yep.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. There's some countries like the Czech Republic, for instance, that do subsidize healthy soils over just subsidizing, higher yields of corn and soybean, which is the way that we largely do it here in this country. So
Right. So just to share, again, I probably am moving a little bit more to the left on your 6 characters of personality. But my husband and I are so committed to this idea. We're actually going to Hawaii for 5 weeks in January and taking a 2-week class on natural organic farming that actually builds your soil and doesn't destroy it.
And there's so many co-benefits to that. I mean, the amount of benefits to even, we have this aesthetic value that's been sold to us that lawns are a great thing. Lawns are biologically dead, and yet there's so much wrapped around in peer pressure from neighbors to marketing. But like Aaron and I talk all the time about, like, there's nothing alive here. If you can put vegetable crops in and plants and pollinators, I mean, you help the stormwater retention, you help the cooling of the urban area, you create wildlife habitat, you create food for your neighbors and yourself. That has a lot of rich value and reduction in CO2. A lawn doesn't really do anything for you, but yet we've been sold that aesthetic. So how do you chip away at that aesthetic?
Put in a bunch of wildflowers. I was out in my native plant bed, and even today, after the frost we had, I still see bees going to some of these native flowers to get some kind of nourishment and to go then cross-pollinate something else. So I'm learning, and I'm willing to learn. And I think all of us have to be willing to learn.
I hesitate to butt in, but I'm getting some chat from a couple folks that have had to head out already as we are past our 8:30 time. I also see another question in the chat. How important is water vapor in comparison to CO2 for heating the earth? And I guess my question to tag on that would be, how much does our water vapor levels change? Have we been changing that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. A slide that I left off tonight. So water vapor basically keeps our atmosphere 40 degrees warmer. CO2 is about 20 degrees. So that's the combined 60 degrees warmer in terms of keeping our atmosphere warmer than it would be if we did not have water vapor or CO2. A couple of other things to unpack here. Water vapor has gone up about 5 to 10% over the last 50 years or so. Carbon dioxide is now about 30%. So we see that rise. So relatively, they've gone up. Now, the other thing to remember is that how long CO2 remains in the atmosphere. So the estimate is that 100 years from now, 80% of what we emit today is still in the atmosphere, having an impact. And 1,000 years from now, 20% of what we emit today is still in the atmosphere, having an impact. It has a huge residence, what we call residence time, or a long tail. So things that we emitted at the start of the Industrial Revolution are still having impacts today on the atmosphere and on the climate that we're seeing. And so that's the important difference between the two, where the water is cycled, this consistent, persistent cycling between precip, falling, runoff, evaporation, the clouds, precip, we have that cycle there. So that's a little bit difference between those two radiative forcings.
So reinforcement in the chat for Kiss the Ground. But another question, can you talk about unlivability factor due to the increase of heat and humidity?
I can give you a couple of anecdotes, what we've seen routinely now over the last decade in parts of the Middle East, near the Persian Gulf, where you have temperatures of 115 degrees and dew points of 90, 92. So that's a heat index of 165. So there are definitely areas in the world, on the globe, already challenged from a livability standpoint. You could argue that the question of livability is coming up out west when we deal with these heat waves and wildfires. And are we building in areas that are challenging, as the climate changes? These are all complex compound issues, obviously, because it's resource management, it's climate, but is it areas that, because of the way that climate is changing, are they conducive to building new developments in certain areas, surrounded by, materials that's persistently dry now because of changing climate? I think, we have a lot of questions about livability in a lot of areas, and we see future, a lot of studies showing migrations from coastal areas into regions, perhaps like the Great Lakes or farther north in the country, to areas where, food can still be grown and maintained. So these were what we call known unknowns. We don't know what the full extent of them will be, but to the best of our knowledge, this is, the things that we sort of anticipate in the future.
And you can also look at things like sea level rise, where it's already inundating Pacific Island nations.
Yeah.
There was the wonderful movie that's out about Kiribati, and we had the filmmaker in last year. Off the top of my head, I forget the title of it now. It'll come to me in a second. But they specifically kind of follow a family there, and this is an island where they've actually bought property on another island to move the entire nation because they're going to be underwater. And I had a conversation with somebody about this once, and the person really knows economic models and said, well, it's not a big deal. Like, their economy is really, really small, so it'll be okay. But then you think about, what does it mean to have a culture disappear because their land is gone, and like their whole cultural existence is tied to that place. And I kind of had to challenge them on that. Like, I have a hard time rectifying that that's okay, just because the dollars and cents involved, because then you inherently mean that that culture and those people have no inherent value. But that is a challenge they're already facing, and they've already started to think about long term. The likelihood of them having land in 2100 is very small as a nation.
And OT's ARC.
Yes, thank you.
And I think we do need to bring this section to a close. As Caleb said, we are moving over time. And thank you very much, Aaron and Jason. And I'm going to suggest that we go ahead and do the reflection time and the sharing. And although, Tim, are you wanting to do the closing before we go into that? Is that?
I can do that whenever.
Okay. I mean, if you're going to stick around, Tim, I think we'll wait a little later.
Well, if you don't mind, I might do it now. Are you talking about kind of once we close, then there's just time for open discussion?
Yes. Yes.
Let me give the homework now, and then those who want to stick around can do that. If that works.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Well, for this week, for your homework assignment, we're asking you to think back to the opening worship about covenant, and hold that in conversation with what you've heard from our speakers today, and ask yourself, what signs of God's covenant do you see around you? As you go about your world, walk around outside, what signs of God's covenant do you see around you? Can you spot a rainbow this week? Or how else does God uphold this covenant with us and all creation?
Okay, thank you, Tim. And now we are going to take, and I think Caleb, again, because of time, we'll take maybe 4 minutes for each. We do want to make sure we close by 9, but yeah, if you have any other either comments or questions, I think I saw Jason. I'm going to move to gallery view. I think Jason is still
I'm here.
with-
Yep.
Yep, there he is. If you want to share anything from your group or just any other comments.
In my small conversation, Jason, we really appreciated the ways you're leading us into our next session, and we're eager for some of the justice issues to come up. But we appreciated your naming of segregation and dark side of empathy, and those are themes that are going to come to play in multiple ways as we move on here.
Yeah, I mean, that does remind me to just mention that Sibona Mube from the Brethren in Christ Church in Zimbabwe will be one of our speakers next week, and Marcia Wilson, who works with Ohio Interfaith Power and Light, will be reflecting particularly on racism in the U.S. and how that intersects with climate justice.
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I just wanted to say, this time was kind of billed as kind of the science guys, and they did that. But I'm sorry that Aaron's not here, but Jason, I just want to tell you, I just really appreciated what both of you brought, because it was such a nice mixture of the science and the humanity and the ethics around climate change and trying to tackle this together. So I'm very grateful, and I'm really looking forward to getting both of your slides, because I think there's so much really helpful information in both of them.
Well, thanks. We've had the good fortune of having a lot of people we've worked with over the last, for me, 9 years. And I think every one of those people we've talked to has kind of brought more to the conversation. So I have to acknowledge all those conversations I had and people I work with, like Aaron.
Well, I think let's end it there. We have a couple minutes before 9, unless anyone really wants to say something else. Yes, I would agree with Mark. So appreciate, Jason, the way that you weave together ethics and the human part and the science, and did was clear about that idea that science doesn't answer all the questions around this. And of course, part of the purpose of this is to have a spiritual and more religious conversation around climate change, because we need to be having conversations at all levels, not just at a scientific level. So thank you.